I had been planning the trip for months. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away from everything: work, noise, and people. I picked a spot in northern Arizona, near the Coconino National Forest, somewhere deep enough that I wouldn't see another person for days. It was the fall of 2018, and I was 27 at the time. I had camped before, but never this deep, never this far from everything. That was part of why I chose it. I wanted isolation. The drive there took nearly 7 hours from Phoenix. Most of the last stretch was on uneven dirt roads, winding between tall pine trees that seemed to grow thicker the farther I went. The GPS stopped working about an hour before I reached my planned site, so I followed an old printed map. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No cars, no birds, not even wind for a while. Felt like the world had gone still. By the time I parked near a clearing, the sun was dropping low. I set up camp beside a narrow creek that ran behind a line of large rocks. The air was cooler than I expected, and I could see my breath when the wind passed. The forest floor was soft, covered in pine needles that muffled my footsteps. Everything smelled like damp wood and dirt. After pitching my tent and getting a fire going, I ate a simple meal and sat watching the light fade behind the trees. The forest turned black fast, faster than I was ready for. The sound of flowing water was steady behind me, and the fire cracked quietly in front. I should have felt calm, but there was something off about the silence. It wasn't natural. I kept realizing what was missing. No insects, no owls, no night sounds at all. It felt like everything around me was holding its breath. I brushed it off as nerves from being alone. I had never camped this deep before, and my mind was probably making things up. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I remember turning off my flashlight before going to sleep and lying there, staring at the fabric of the tent. I could hear the faintest noises outside, small cracks, rustling, maybe animals moving around. Normal stuff, I told myself. Normal. At some point in the night, I woke up for no clear reason. The fire had gone out, and the forest was completely black. There was no moonlight, nothing. I couldn't see even my hand in front of my face. I listened carefully and realized I could hear slow, crunching footsteps in the distance. Not near the tent yet, but moving around somewhere out in the dark. The sound would stop for a few seconds, then start again, slow and careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I stayed still, trying to convince myself it was just a deer. The steps sounded too heavy though, too slow and spaced out. Deer don't move like that. I felt my chest tighten. I waited there, barely breathing, for what felt like forever until the footsteps faded away into nothing. I didn't sleep after that. When daylight came, I walked around the area, checking the ground for tracks. The dirt was uneven, but near the trees behind my tent, I saw what looked like faint shoe prints, human ones. The soil was dry, so they weren't deep, but they were clear enough. Someone had walked around the edge of my camp. That moment hit me hard, realizing that someone had been close enough to see my tent, maybe watching me sleep. I scanned the trees for a long time but saw nothing. I thought about packing up, but it felt ridiculous to leave over something I couldn't even prove. Maybe a hiker passed through. Maybe someone camped nearby. I tried to reason it out, but something about those prints bothered me. They weren't heading toward or away, they circled. Whoever it was had walked a full circle around where I slept. That day, I hiked a few miles around to explore, trying to distract myself. The forest was beautiful but strange in how empty it felt. I didn't see a single bird or animal the whole time, just endless trees and the sound of my own boots. I took pictures of the area, the creek, the hills in the distance. When I came back to camp later, something felt wrong again, subtle but different. My backpack was sitting outside the tent. I hadn't left it there. I always kept it inside. The zippers were open, and a few of my things were scattered: flashlight, a small knife, a pack of jerky. Nothing was stolen, but it had clearly been gone through. I looked around again, trying to spot any movement, any sign of someone watching. Nothing. It was silent except for the faint trickle of the creek. That night, I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to make light that could be seen from far away. I sat in the dark, just listening. Around midnight, I heard something again. Faint footsteps, slower this time, closer. They came from the trees on the opposite side of the creek. The sound of twigs snapping, then silence, then another step. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing. It went on like that for maybe 10 minutes, movement, pause, movement, then nothing. The worst part wasn't knowing if whoever it was could see me. The forest was pitch black, but I had no idea what the other side looked like. I didn't sleep that night either. When dawn finally came, I decided I was done. I packed up everything as fast as I could. Before leaving, I checked across the creek. I found a small section of mud near the bank that had fresh footprints. Clear ones, deep, facing directly toward my campsite. Whoever it was had been standing there for a long time. The prints were deep enough to show the tread pattern of boots, not bare feet. I could even tell one foot had dragged slightly, like the person had shifted their weight while watching. I drove out fast, barely stopping for anything. The road out seemed longer than before, winding endlessly through the forest. My hands were shaking the whole way. When I finally reached paved roads and cell signal, I pulled over and sat there for a long time, trying to calm down. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone walked near my tent and didn't steal anything? They wouldn't take it seriously. When I got home that night, I emptied my bag. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A small folded piece of paper that wasn't mine, wedged in one of the side pockets. It was plain and dirty, like it had been in the dirt for a while. On it was a single drawing, done with a dull pencil. It showed a tent, almost exactly like mine, with a tall figure standing behind it, drawn in simple lines. No face, no details, just a shadow shape. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand. I hadn't seen that paper before. It wasn't in there when I packed. Someone had to put it in my bag after I arrived. For weeks after that, I kept thinking about the nights I lay awake in that forest. How quiet it was, how those footsteps stopped and started. I replayed the sound of them over and over, wondering how close that person really got. I haven't been camping since. I still drive sometimes, far from the city, just to see the open spaces again, but I never stay overnight. Every time I pull off onto a dirt road, I get that same tight feeling in my chest. The quiet used to be peaceful to me, but now it feels like something waiting, something that watches back. Sometimes I think about that paper, about the drawing. I still have it tucked away in a box. I don't know why I keep it. Maybe to remind myself that the worst things out there aren't ghosts or monsters. They're people. People who move quietly, wait patiently, and choose not to be seen. That forest is still out there, and somewhere in it, someone else might be setting up their tent right now, feeling that same calm silence before night falls. Not realizing someone could be standing just past the trees, watching, waiting the way they did with me. It was late August 2014 when I decided to go on a short camping trip with my dad's old friend, Mark. He was the kind of man who knew the woods better than most people knew their own backyard. I had just turned 21, and that summer I'd been working nonstop at a construction site in northern Colorado. I hadn't had a real break in months, and when Mark mentioned he was heading out for a quiet weekend near the Poudre River, I thought it'd be good for me to clear my head and get away from everything. The plan was simple. 2 nights, a few miles upriver from the last campsite, just us, our tents, and the sound of the water. No service, no crowds, no one to bother us. I liked the sound of that, We left early on a Friday morning. The drive took about 3 hours, and then we spent another hour hiking along a dirt trail that followed the river. It was late afternoon when we finally picked a spot, a flat patch of ground about 30 feet from the water, surrounded by tall pines and thick brush. There wasn't another soul in sight. The nearest marked campground was 5 miles downriver, and even that one didn't get much traffic this late in the summer. We set up camp just before dusk. The air was warm, and everything smelled like pine sap and dirt. I remember feeling strangely at ease, like I had stepped out of the noise of the world and back into something quiet and natural. The only sounds were the river moving and the occasional crack from the fire Mark started. That first night went by without anything strange. We ate some canned food, drank a few beers, and sat by the fire until the flames died down to orange coals. I crawled into my tent, listened to the sound of the river, and fell asleep easily. The next morning was cloudy, and there was a chill in the air. I woke up early, walked down to the riverbank, and washed my face in the cold water. Mark was still asleep, so I took a short walk along the edge of the woods. The ground was damp, and the forest felt heavy and quiet. It wasn't until I came back that I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the mud by the riverbank that weren't ours. They looked fresh. They were from boots, not sneakers, and judging by the size, they belonged to a grown man. They led from the direction of the woods, stopped right near our fire pit, and then turned back toward the trees. I figured it was probably just some hiker who passed through early in the morning, maybe while we were asleep. Still, it didn't sit right with me. Mark didn't seem too concerned when I mentioned it later, so I tried not to think much about it. We spent the day fishing, cooking, and exploring around the area. It was peaceful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might have been nearby at some point. Late in the afternoon, we found a small clearing up the hill that had an old, half-broken picnic table and the remains of a fire pit that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Mark said it was probably from an old campsite that got closed down when the Forest Service rerouted the trail. I didn't think much of it then, but that spot would come back to my mind later that night. When the sun started going down, the temperature dropped fast. The wind picked up, and the trees started moving in slow waves, creaking and rustling like they were whispering to each other. I remember sitting close to the fire, feeling that strange uneasiness again. The forest just seemed different at night. The shadows stretched longer, and every sound, every crack, every distant rustle sounded closer than it really was. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that wasn't part of the woods. It was faint, but it was there, like metal scraping against rock. I lay still in my tent, trying to figure out what it was. Came again, closer this time. A long dragging sound, then silence. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing else followed. I told myself it was probably an animal knocking something over, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I stayed awake, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, watching shadows move with the flicker of the dying fire. Around 3 a.m., I finally drifted off. The next morning, I noticed something strange again. A few of our things had been moved. One of the empty beer cans was lying several feet from where we left it, and Mark's folding chair was tipped over near the edge of the trees. He thought maybe the wind did it, but the air had been still most of the night. After breakfast, I went to refill our water jugs by the river and noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Downstream, maybe 50 yards from our camp, there were more footprints in the mud, fresh again, and this time they led both toward and away from our sight. Whoever it was had come by again during the night. I didn't say much, but I started feeling that edge of fear that you try to reason away. You tell yourself it's nothing, but deep down, something feels off. That evening, things got worse. We decided to turn in early since the clouds were rolling in and it looked like rain. Around 10 p.m., the wind picked up again, and I could hear branches snapping somewhere in the dark. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. Then, Sometime after midnight, I woke up again. But this time, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I heard footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate. They weren't animal steps. They were heavy, uneven, like boots sinking into soft earth. They stopped right outside my tent. I didn't move. I just froze, listening. The sound of breathing, slow and shallow, was barely audible through the fabric. I could smell something faint, like sweat and smoke. Then the footsteps shifted and moved toward the fire pit. I heard something metallic again, a soft clink, and then the sound of dirt being moved. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't. My body just wouldn't do it. After maybe a minute, the sound faded, and the woods went dead quiet. I waited another 5 minutes before unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. The fire was completely out. I couldn't see anyone, but when I looked toward the trees, my flashlight caught something. It was a figure standing between two pines, not moving, just watching. The light hit their face for half a second, pale, expressionless, and then they turned and disappeared into the dark. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. At sunrise, I woke Mark and told him we needed to pack up and leave. When we went to check around the site, the footprints were everywhere. Whoever it was had been walking around our camp for a while. Then we found something that made both of us go silent. Near the fire pit, half buried in the dirt, was a small knife, rusted, old, but recently handled. We didn't bother eating breakfast. We just packed up and left as fast as we could, barely speaking. When we got back to the trailhead, Mark went straight to the ranger station to report what happened. The ranger told us that there had been a few complaints over the past month. Campers reporting a man wandering around sites late at night, always leaving before anyone could get a clear look at him. They hadn't caught him yet. That was the last time I ever went camping that far out. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. The footsteps, the smell, that blank face standing between the trees. I know what I saw. It wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was a real person. Someone who'd been out there watching us for God knows how long. What scares me most isn't that he was there. It's that he didn't do anything. He just watched. And I still wonder, if I hadn't woken up when I did, if I hadn't looked out of that tent, what he might have done next. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to do something stupid, something I thought would make a good story to tell later. I was 23 at the time, living in a small town in northern Michigan, not far from a place called Pine Hollow Cemetery. It wasn't a big graveyard, just a quiet patch of land tucked between two long stretches of forest and an old dirt road that no one used after sunset. I had driven past it hundreds of times, and every time I did, I noticed how still it looked. No lights, no fence, just rows of crooked headstones and patches of weeds that reached up through the gravel. I'd always wondered what it would feel like to spend a night there alone. That Friday, the temperature had started to drop fast. The trees were half bare, the ground covered in crisp brown leaves that made a sound like breaking paper when you stepped on them. I packed my small green tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a cheap camping stove, and a few cans of soup. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I remember thinking that if I mentioned I was camping in a graveyard, people would call me insane. But I told myself it was harmless, just a patch of land with some old stones. I parked my car off the dirt road, a little way from the cemetery's edge, around 6 p.m. The sun was low and bleeding orange light through the trees. I walked down the narrow path with my gear, hearing only the crunch of leaves under my boots. There was a thin fog starting to form on the ground, the kind that crawls low and clings to everything. It felt strange stepping between the rows of graves, seeing names carved in fading letters, some from the 1800s, others from the early 1900s. Most of the headstones leaned forward or sideways, their bases sunk into soft soil. I chose a small clearing at the far end, near a group of trees where the ground rose slightly. The area was open enough for my tent, but still surrounded by the graves. There was a stone angel missing one arm a few feet from where I decided to set up. Its face had worn smooth over the years, but the shape of its eyes still seemed sharp in the dim light. I tried not to think about it as I set up camp. By the time I finished, it was nearly dark. I lit a small fire using dry sticks and some old newspaper I'd brought. The flame gave the stones around me an uneven glow, and their long shadows stretched out like arms. The air smelled damp and earthy, like rain and soil mixed together. I ate one can of soup straight from the pot and leaned back against my backpack, listening to the quiet. The silence out there wasn't like normal silence. It felt heavier, thicker. The woods didn't make their usual sounds. No insects, no rustling, nothing. Just the low hum of the wind. Every now and then, I'd hear it drag across the tops of the gravestones and push the fog around. Around 9 p.m., I decided to walk around a little with my flashlight. The beam cut through the fog in narrow white lines. The ground was soft, uneven in places. I passed a few cracked headstones, one that had fallen flat, and another that looked freshly cleaned, though I doubted anyone came here often. I noticed something odd. A few graves had small piles of rocks on them. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe just some old tradition. When I returned to my tent, I checked my phone. No signal, not even one bar. The fire was dying down, and the cold was starting to sink into my clothes. I zipped myself inside the tent and tried to get comfortable. The ground beneath me was uneven and cold even through the sleeping bag. I closed my eyes, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying small sounds. Something brushing the tent, or a distant thump, though I told myself it was probably just branches falling. Sometime later, I woke up suddenly. My mouth was dry, and I didn't know what had stirred me. The fire outside was completely dead, but I could still see a faint light through the tent fabric. It wasn't the moon. It was dimmer, moving slightly. I sat up, my heart beating faster. The air was so cold that my breath came out like smoke. I unzipped the tent halfway and looked out. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There was a faint light about 50 feet away, low to the ground, like someone holding a flashlight pointed downward. But there was no sound, no footsteps, no talking. I kept watching, trying to make sense of it. The light moved slowly between the graves, stopping every few seconds. It almost looked like someone crouching down. I told myself it might be a caretaker or someone visiting a grave late at night, though it didn't make sense. No one would come here at midnight. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The light drifted closer for a while, then stopped near one of the piles of rocks I'd seen earlier. After a minute or so, it just went out. Complete darkness again. I waited a long time before moving. My hands were shaking slightly. I finally zipped the tent shut, laid back down, and told myself to ignore it. Maybe it was some kind of reflection, or someone driving by on the dirt road with their headlights off angle. But my mind didn't buy it. When I woke again, the faint light of dawn was seeping through the tent. The air inside was damp, and the ground felt even colder. I stepped outside to stretch and saw that the fog was thicker than before, rolling between the graves like smoke. My fire pit was soaked through. Everything felt wet and dead quiet. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Just a few feet from my tent, there was a small, neat pile of rocks. The stones were round and smooth, the kind you'd find near a creek, stacked carefully in a little pyramid. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember if I'd somehow made it myself, though I knew I hadn't. The air felt different, heavier, colder. I packed my things as fast as I could, hardly taking time to fold the tent properly. When I reached my car, I glanced back once. The fog made it hard to see, but I thought I could make out that same spot of light again, faint and flickering, somewhere deep between the rows of stones. I drove off down the dirt road without looking in the rearview mirror. That night, when I got home, I couldn't shake the image of that pile of rocks. I even thought about going back the next day to check, but something deep in my chest told me not to. I didn't sleep much. A week later, I drove past Pine Hollow again in the daylight. The fog was gone, and the place looked calm and harmless, the way it always did. I slowed down near the spot where I'd parked before, more out of curiosity than anything else. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the side of the road, right where the dirt meets the grass, there was another small pile of rocks, the same size, the same shape. I never went back to Pine Hollow after that. Even now, years later, I still think about that night whenever I see fog or stacked stones on a trail. I tell myself it was just someone else out there, maybe a hiker or a bored local playing a prank. But deep down, I know how quiet it was out there, how still everything felt. And I remember waking up in that tent, seeing that faint light moving between the graves, slow, deliberate, careful. Whatever it was doing, it knew I was there, and it left me something to remember it by. It was the summer of 2014 when my dad's friend, Tom, invited us on a weekend camping trip in northern Montana. My dad couldn't go because of work, but he told me I should still go along since Tom was like family. I was 17, just old enough to think I could handle the woods, but still young enough to second-guess myself when things got quiet. Tom was in his early 40s, a quiet guy who loved the outdoors, and I figured it would just be a calm weekend of fishing and hiking. Nothing weird. We left early on a Friday morning in Tom's old Ford truck, the kind that rattled when you went past 50. The drive took nearly 6 hours, through long empty roads, thick forests, and stretches of open land that looked untouched for miles. Tom told me we'd be camping near a small lake that wasn't even marked on most maps. He said he'd found it years ago while hunting and that hardly anyone ever went there. That part made me both excited and uneasy. I liked the idea of being away from people, but there was something about hardly anyone ever goes there that stuck in my head. By the time we got there, the sun was starting to drop behind the trees. The area looked like something out of a photograph. Tall pines surrounding a calm, dark lake, the ground covered in layers of dry needles. The air smelled like pine sap and damp earth. There was a small clearing just a few steps from the water where we set up the tents. Tom had brought all the good gear: a big cooler, lanterns, fishing rods, even a folding table. I felt like we were set for a good weekend. After setting up, Tom cooked some sausages over the fire. We didn't talk much. He wasn't the type to make small talk. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional splash from the lake. It was peaceful, but the kind of quiet that made you notice every little thing. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl. The night got colder than I expected, and when I finally went to my tent, I could still hear Tom moving around outside, probably cleaning up. The first night passed fine, though I remember waking up once in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving through the trees. It wasn't close, but it was steady, heavy footsteps, like a person walking carefully. I thought maybe it was Tom taking a late walk, but the steps stopped too suddenly, like whoever it was realized they were making noise. I lay there listening for a long time, heart pounding, but eventually, the sound faded, and I told myself it was just an animal. The next morning, I noticed Tom looked tired, like he hadn't slept much either. His boots were muddy, even though the ground around camp was dry. I figured maybe he went to the lake early or took a walk before sunrise. I didn't ask. We went fishing most of the day, caught a few trout, and cleaned them by the water. The air felt heavier that afternoon, humid and still, like the weather was about to change. I remember a strange metallic smell in the air near the woods, something like rust or old blood, but I couldn't see anything that could have caused it. That night, things felt different. The forest was louder, but not in a natural way. I could hear faint cracks and snaps deeper in the trees, not from one place but scattered, like something moving back and forth. Tom sat by the fire longer than usual, barely speaking. His eyes kept shifting toward the dark tree line. At one point, I noticed him slide his hunting knife from its sheath and keep it close beside his chair. I didn't say anything, but that made me nervous. When I went to my tent later, I could still hear the fire popping and Tom shifting around outside. I fell asleep eventually, but sometime during the night, I woke up again. Not from a sound, but from the silence. The fire was out. The forest was dead quiet. Even the crickets had stopped. That's when I noticed light flickering faintly through the tent wall. Not orange like firelight, but white, thin, like a flashlight beam moving around. It wasn't steady. It waved across the trees. I thought maybe Tom was checking something, but then I realized I couldn't hear his footsteps or breathing. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moon was low, and the forest looked pale and empty. The light was coming from deeper in the trees, moving slowly, not like someone holding a flashlight, but lower to the ground, weaving between trunks. It would disappear behind a tree, then reappear somewhere else, always in slow, deliberate movements. I stayed completely still for maybe 10 minutes, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard something faint but sharp, metal clinking. Not once, but twice. It sounded like something brushing against metal, maybe gear or tools. My stomach dropped because Tom's knife and hatchet were both sitting by the fire pit, untouched. The light stopped moving after that, and for a few seconds everything froze. Then there was a sound, the quiet crack of a branch being stepped on, close this time, maybe 20 feet from my tent. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would give me away. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The sound came again, slower, heavier, almost dragging. Then I heard Tom's voice outside the tent, quiet but clear enough to recognize. He said my name once, then nothing. I waited, frozen, staring at the tent wall. After maybe a minute, I forced myself to open the zipper just enough to look. Tom wasn't there. His chair was empty. His boots and flashlight were gone. The forest was still. I sat there until sunrise, too scared to move. When light finally came through the trees, I stepped out. Everything looked normal, the tents, the lake, the trees. But Tom's tracks led away from the camp toward the woods, and they didn't come back. I followed them for a while, maybe 100 yards, until they suddenly stopped in a patch of soft dirt near a fallen log. No prints leading away, just his last steps pressed deep like he'd stopped suddenly. I went back to camp, packed up what I could, and hiked to the truck. The whole drive out felt endless. The forest seemed to close in tighter the farther I went. When I finally reached the main road and got a cell signal, I called for help. They searched for Tom for 3 days. They found his flashlight and knife near the log where his tracks stopped, but no sign of him. No body, no torn clothes, nothing. The sheriff said maybe he wandered off and got lost, but it didn't make sense. Tom knew those woods better than anyone. I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times. The moving light, the clinking metal, his voice saying my name when I knew it couldn't have been him. I don't believe in anything supernatural, but something about that night never sat right. The sound of the footsteps, the strange smell, the way his tracks just ended. It all points to something human, something out there with us that night. Sometimes, when I'm driving through quiet wooded areas, I'll catch myself looking between the trees, half expecting to see that same flicker of light weaving through the dark. I haven't been camping since that weekend. Every time I think about going back, I remember that stillness, the kind that only happens when something living in the woods wants you to stop moving. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the south of France. I was 27 at the time, and I'd been backpacking around Europe for a few months, staying mostly in hostels and cheap lodges. But I wanted something quieter for a few days, somewhere away from the constant sound of buses, people, and traffic. I had rented a small car in Marseille and drove west, following small country roads that wound through vineyards and rolling hills. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, and the idea of sleeping alone under the stars felt like exactly what I needed. By late afternoon, I found a small camping area near a place called Saint-Étienne-de-Lys, close to the Dordogne River. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing off a dirt road that seemed used by hikers and hunters sometimes. I parked my car a bit off the main path, carried my tent and backpack about 20 meters in, and started setting up. The ground was dry, covered with pine needles and patches of grass. Everything smelled of earth and resin. It was peaceful, and I felt a strange kind of calm that I hadn't felt in months. After I pitched my tent, I went for a short walk toward the river. The area was quiet except for insects buzzing and the occasional bird call. I found some animal tracks in the soft mud near the water but didn't think much of them. Probably a deer or wild boar. When I got back, the sun had dipped lower and the light had turned orange through the trees. I started a small fire, made some noodles on my camping stove, and ate sitting on a flat rock. It was a good evening, almost too calm. As it got darker, I noticed something odd. Across the clearing, maybe 50 or 60 meters away, there was a faint glimmer between the trees. It looked like a reflection, like metal catching light. I thought it could have been a car parked deeper in the woods, maybe another camper. It didn't bother me much. I figured I wasn't the only one who had found this spot. But after a while, the reflection disappeared, and I didn't see any light or hear any movement. By around 10, I got into my tent. The night was cooler than I expected, and I zipped myself inside the sleeping bag, listening to the faint rustle of wind through the trees. I must have drifted off for a while because when I woke up again, the fire had gone out and everything was pitch black. My phone said it was 2:17 a.m. That's when I heard footsteps. They weren't heavy, more like soft crunches on dry leaves, slow and deliberate. I froze instantly. My tent was small, just a thin nylon wall between me and whatever was outside. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a fox maybe, but the steps were too slow, too spaced apart. They stopped near where my fire pit had been. I could hear faint breathing, the kind that someone makes when trying not to make noise but still can't help it. I stayed perfectly still. The breathing went on for what felt like a full minute. Then the footsteps started again, circling, coming closer to the tent. My heart was pounding so loud that I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The sound stopped again, right next to me, maybe 2 feet from the tent wall. I could see a faint shadow against the fabric. Someone was standing there. I didn't move or make a sound. After about 30 seconds, the shadow shifted and walked away. I waited until I couldn't hear anything anymore, then slowly reached for the small knife I kept near my bag. I didn't go outside. I just sat there in the dark, listening, every sense on edge. Eventually, I must have drifted off again because I woke up to faint daylight. The first thing I did was unzip the tent and step outside. Everything looked normal at first, but then I noticed the footprints. They weren't animal tracks, they were from boots. The prints came from the direction of the woods, stopped right next to my tent, and then turned back the same way. There were at least 2 different sizes. That's when I saw something that made my stomach twist. Near the fire pit, there was a crushed cigarette, but still fresh. I hadn't smoked the night before. Someone had been standing right where I cooked, maybe watching me. I packed my stuff as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so bad that I could barely take down the tent poles. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. I loaded everything into the car, threw the tent in the back without folding it, and drove out of there. I didn't stop until I reached a small town about 15 kilometers away. I parked near a bakery, went inside, and sat at a table. My legs were still trembling. I told myself it was just some locals wandering through the woods at night, maybe hunters. But deep down, it didn't feel like that. Still, after a few hours, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I'd overreacted, that I'd left all my gear and food behind for no reason. Around noon, I decided to go back, at least to grab what I'd left. When I drove back toward the site, I noticed tire tracks on the dirt road that weren't there before. The ground had been dry, so they were clear. Someone else had been there since I left. When I got to the clearing, everything looked different. My fire pit was gone, like someone had kicked it apart. My backpack, which I'd left beside the tent area, was missing. There were more boot prints now all over the clearing, some leading deeper into the trees. That cigarette butt was gone too. I stood there for a long minute, just looking at the mess, and that's when I saw something new. On a tree near where I'd pitched my tent, there was a small mark carved into the bark. It looked like an X or maybe a symbol, but it was fresh, the wood still pale where it had been cut. I didn't touch it. I turned around and got back in the car, my chest tight. I didn't even look back when I drove away. For the rest of that trip, I couldn't sleep properly. I'd wake up in my hotel or hostel room thinking I heard footsteps outside the window. Every time I stopped for gas or food, I looked at people too closely, trying to see if anyone recognized me. I never saw anyone following me, but that didn't make it easier. A week later, I was staying in a small guest house near Bordeaux. One morning, while scrolling through local news on my phone, I saw a short article that made my stomach drop. It said that a local police unit had discovered a makeshift camp in the woods near Saint-Étienne-de-Lys, not far from where I'd stayed. The report mentioned stolen camping equipment, cooking tools, and clothes, along with several photos of missing tourists that had been tacked to the inside of a tent. They said they were still looking for whoever had been living there. There was no name, no photo of a suspect, just a brief note asking anyone who'd been in the area recently to contact authorities. I never did. I deleted the article and closed my phone. Even now, years later, I still remember the sound of those footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Sometimes when I'm camping or even just walking home at night, I hear that same rhythm in my head. I haven't been camping alone since that trip. I don't think I ever will again. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to go hunting alone for the weekend. I was 31, working construction back then, and hadn't had a real break in months. I wanted quiet, just me, the woods, and my rifle. I drove 4 hours out of Denver to a remote patch of land near the San Juan Mountains in Colorado, an area I'd hunted before but never camped overnight in. The air was colder up there, dry and sharp, and by the time I parked my truck at the trailhead, the sun was already dipping behind the ridges, painting the trees orange and gold. I packed light tent, sleeping bag, small propane stove, a cooler with some food, and my rifle. I hiked about 2 miles off the trail into a small clearing surrounded by thick pines. It was perfect. The forest was quiet except for the wind brushing through the branches and the occasional distant crow. I set up my tent close to a fallen log and made a small fire before it got dark. The smell of the smoke mixed with pine needles and cold dirt. I sat there for a while just listening. No cars, no phones, no people. I didn't realize how much I'd missed that kind of silence until I was sitting in it again. The first night was uneventful. I heard a few branches snap in the distance, but that's normal. Animals moving around. I kept my rifle next to me just in case, zipped up my tent, and fell asleep around 10 p.m. The next morning, frost covered the grass and my breath came out white. I made coffee on the stove, ate a protein bar, and hiked east to a ridge where I'd spotted elk a few years earlier. I didn't see any large game, just a few squirrels and a deer that bolted before I could even aim. By late afternoon, I was tired and decided to head back to camp before it got dark. When I got there, something felt different. It wasn't anything obvious. Everything looked about the same, but there was this strange stillness in the air. Even the wind had stopped. I noticed my cooler lid was slightly open. I knew I had shut it tight in the morning. My first thought was a raccoon or maybe a bear. I checked the ground but didn't see any big prints, just faint scuffs in the dirt, like someone had brushed the surface with a stick or their shoe. I set the cooler back, tied it shut with rope, and made a fire as the light faded. I sat close to the flames, facing the tree line. I don't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Every small crack from the woods made me turn my head. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps moving behind my tent. Not heavy but careful, as if someone was trying not to make noise. I froze. My first instinct was to grab the rifle. I waited, staring at the tent wall, trying to listen past the pounding of my own heartbeat. The steps stopped after a few seconds. I stayed up for hours after that, barely blinking, the fire dying down to red coals. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep just before dawn. The next day, I checked around camp again. No real tracks, just more of those light scuffs near the tent and fire pit. It didn't make sense. If it was an animal, there'd be clearer prints or droppings. I walked about 100 yards in every direction, trying to find any sign of what had come through, but the ground was covered in pine needles, and they masked everything. I decided to cut my hunting short and head out the next morning. Something about the place felt wrong now, and I wasn't in the mood to push my luck. Still, I stayed one more night because packing out after dark wasn't smart. That evening, I made the fire bigger than before and kept my rifle right beside me. I didn't eat much, just sat watching the flames. Around 9 p.m., I noticed something through the trees, two faint shapes standing maybe 40 yards out. At first, I thought it was just shadows, but they didn't move with the wind. I squinted and realized they were upright, human-shaped. I stood up slowly, heart pounding hard enough I could hear it in my ears. The shapes stayed still for a few seconds, then one of them shifted slightly, like someone adjusting their weight. I called out instinctively, but no one answered. They didn't run, didn't make a sound. Then, one of them crouched down and vanished behind a bush, and the other followed. I stood there staring at that spot for at least 5 minutes, barely breathing. I finally grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward where they'd been, but the light caught only branches and fog. Nothing moved. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside, the cracking of a twig, the rustle of leaves, felt louder, sharper, closer. I kept the fire going until sunrise. When morning came, I started packing immediately. My hands were shaking as I rolled up the tent and loaded my gear. Before leaving, I checked the edge of the clearing where I'd seen the shapes. The ground was disturbed. Pine needles scattered, a patch of dirt that looked pressed down like someone had knelt there. A single footprint caught my eye. It was barefoot, not a boot, not an animal paw, bare human toes, pressed deep into the cold dirt. I took a step back, my stomach dropping. Whoever had been there was watching me from close by. I didn't waste a second after that. I threw everything into my pack, grabbed the rifle, and started hiking toward the truck. The whole time, I felt eyes on me. Every few minutes I'd stop and listen, thinking I heard footsteps behind me, but the woods were too quiet. When I finally saw the glint of my truck through the trees, it felt like relief and panic mixed together. I tossed my pack in the bed and unlocked the door. Before getting in, I turned one last time to look down the trail. There was movement, faint and quick, near the tree line. Someone stepping just far enough into view that I could see a shoulder, maybe part of a head. They stood there watching as I slammed the door shut and started the engine. I didn't look back again. I drove straight off that dirt road until I hit the highway and didn't stop until I was nearly 2 hours out. I pulled into a small gas station, my hands still shaking. I sat there for a long time before I could even fill up the tank. Later that week, I told myself it must have been squatters, maybe hunters or locals just messing around. But the thing that never made sense was the footprints, bare feet in freezing weather in the middle of the mountains. A few weeks later, I went online out of curiosity and checked a few local forums for that area. One post caught my eye. It was from a hiker who said he'd found an old campsite near the San Juans that looked abandoned fast. He mentioned a cooler, burned wood, and footprints, bare ones, around the ashes. That was my campsite. I haven't gone camping alone since. Every time I think about it, I still see those figures standing in the trees, silent, patient, watching. And the worst part isn't that I don't know who they were. It's that whoever they were, they never wanted to be found. Now, when I drive through the mountains, I still glance at the tree lines. I tell myself it's just a habit, but deep down, I know I'm still looking for them, and I hope I never see them again. It was early October of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone in northern Arizona. I was 28 at the time, working a job that left me drained and boxed in every single day, so I just wanted to get away from everything for a while. I'd been to that part of Arizona before, around the Navajo Nation area, where the land stretched wide and empty and the nights were dark enough that you could see every single star. I packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, a folding chair, some canned food, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I drove out on a Friday afternoon, parked my car on a dirt path that led off from a small highway, and walked about half a mile in before setting up camp. The air felt dry and thin. It was one of those autumn evenings where the sun dropped fast and the cold came crawling up from the ground. I got the tent up before sunset, gathered some dry sticks, and made a small fire. The silence was heavy. No cars, no voices, just wind and the faint sound of insects. The nearest town was about 40 minutes away. I had no service on my phone, but that was part of why I came. I wanted the quiet. By the time it got dark, the fire had burned down to soft orange embers. I sat in my folding chair, eating beans straight from the can and just staring out at the tree line. The trees looked strange in that light, thin, uneven, almost bent in the distance like they were leaning toward me. I remember thinking how still it all was. Not peaceful, just still. I could hear the occasional snap of a branch far off in the woods, but that wasn't unusual. Coyotes, maybe deer. The desert edge wasn't far off either, so there were jackrabbits, sometimes even elk that wandered this far. It must have been around 10 or 11 when I noticed something. It wasn't a sound at first, more like the feeling that someone was nearby. I kept staring at the dark line of trees, trying to see if my eyes would catch movement, but everything looked the same. Then I heard it. A quick, sharp crack of a twig, closer this time, maybe 30 or 40 feet from the camp. I leaned forward a bit and listened. Nothing, just the wind brushing through the dry grass. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was an animal, maybe even the wind shifting a loose branch. But I couldn't shake that feeling. I threw another piece of wood into the fire just so I could see a little farther. The light reached maybe 20 feet around me, then faded into darkness. The sound came again, but slower this time. Soft footsteps, uneven, like something was trying to move quietly but wasn't used to walking upright. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. When I turned it toward the sound, the beam cut through the dark and hit nothing. Just empty trees. My heart was beating fast, but I told myself it could be anything. I'd read about how sounds can play tricks on you in open spaces, how it's hard to tell how far something really is. So I decided to just sit back down and ignore it. But the thing is, once you know you're not alone out there, you can't really relax again. Every sound stands out. Every breeze feels heavier. I sat there for a long time, eyes wide open, watching the fire burn low. Then I heard breathing. It was faint, but it was there. A long, slow exhale, like someone trying not to make a sound but failing. I turned the flashlight again, sweeping it slowly across the trees, my hand shaking a little. That's when I saw it just for a second. Something crouched behind a tree, low to the ground. I could only see its legs, pale, thin, almost hairless. They weren't shaped right, bent in a strange way, like the knees faced the wrong direction. I froze. My stomach felt like it dropped out of me. I didn't move the light, just stared at that shape until it shifted and disappeared deeper into the dark. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the fire going, sitting close enough that the smoke stung my eyes. Every now and then I'd hear it again. A slow step, a rustle breathing that seemed to circle me. It never came too close, but it stayed out there, watching. I could feel that. The air had that weight to it, the kind that makes you feel like you're being stared at from every direction. Around 4 in the morning, the sky started to lighten a bit, that dull gray color before sunrise. I packed my things fast. I didn't even bother rolling up the tent neatly. I just shoved it into the bag and started heading back toward my car. The ground was uneven, the dirt soft from the dew, and I was moving quick. Every few steps, I glanced behind me, but I didn't see anything. When I got to the car, I threw my stuff in the back seat and got in. The air inside the car was freezing cold. I turned the key, nothing. It didn't start. The engine made this choking noise, then died. My heart started racing. I tried again, pumping the gas, but nothing. I sat there for a second, gripping the wheel, trying to think straight. I didn't want to get out again. Not after what I'd seen, but I had no choice. I popped the hood and stepped out. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like bare human feet, but longer, with the toes spread far apart like someone who'd never worn shoes. The tracks went around the car, circling it, pressed deep into the dirt. I followed them with my eyes, and they led off toward the trees again. There must have been dozens of them, overlapping like whoever it was had been walking around the car for a while, maybe even while I was sitting inside. My mouth went dry. I climbed back into the car, locked the doors, and just sat there, waiting for the sun to rise fully. It took about another half hour for the first real light to come up. Once it did, I tried the car again, and this time it started. I didn't wait. I drove straight out of there, tires kicking up dust all the way down that dirt path. I didn't even look back. When I finally got to the main road, I stopped at a gas station about 20 miles away. I got out to fill up, and when I walked around to the back of the car, I noticed something that still makes my skin crawl to this day. There were handprints, faint, but they're smeared into the dust on my trunk and windows. Long, narrow fingers, like someone with too many joints had pressed their hands against the glass. I stood there for a long minute, just staring at them, trying to convince myself it could have been from when I packed up, or maybe from when I leaned against the car before leaving. But deep down, I knew they weren't mine. I never went back to that area. In the days after, I told myself it was just some person out there. Maybe a local, maybe some drifter trying to scare people off. But there was something wrong about the way it moved, the way it breathed. I don't know what I saw, but I know it wasn't just a man. Every now and then, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and think I hear those same slow footsteps outside, that same steady breathing just beyond the window. I tell myself it's just in my head, that it stayed out there in those woods. But sometimes, when it's dead quiet, I could swear I still hear it circling. I went camping alone in the fall of 2017, just outside a small town called Bend, Oregon. I had always gone camping with friends or family before, but that year I wanted something different. I had just turned 29, and I'd been feeling burnt out from work. My job in Portland had been slowly draining me, and I needed quiet. No phones, no people, no city noise. Just air that didn't smell like exhaust and some time to breathe. I drove my old Tacoma deep into the Deschutes National Forest, past the usual campgrounds and onto a dirt road that looked mostly forgotten. It was early October, the air sharp but not freezing. The trees were starting to thin out in places, letting streaks of late sunlight spill through. I kept driving until I reached a small clearing near a narrow creek. The water ran shallow, only a few inches deep, but it sounded steady and clean. I remember thinking it would be perfect, not too far from the truck, not too close to any trails, just quiet. I parked, set up my small green tent, and gathered enough wood to last through the night. I had a small hatchet and a folding saw, both sharp and solid. My pack held the usual stuff: a sleeping bag, a small gas stove, some freeze-dried meals, a headlamp, a first aid kit, and my old hunting knife I'd had since I was a teenager. The first few hours were perfect. I cooked some instant noodles over the small stove, drank from my water bottle, and watched the sky shift colors through the trees. The air smelled like pine and wet soil. I sat there until the light faded and the woods went dark. When I say dark, I mean pitch black, the kind where you can't see your own hand unless it's inches from your face. It was around 9:30 when I noticed how quiet everything had gotten. I hadn't realized it before, but the sound of crickets and frogs had stopped. Even the creek sounded duller, like it was further away than it should have been. I remember sitting up straight, just listening. No wind, no movement, nothing. Felt wrong. Woods always have some noise, even if it's just branches creaking or water dripping. But this was total stillness. I brushed it off and got into my tent, zipped it up, and laid down. The sleeping bag was warm, and I pulled my beanie down over my ears. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself it was just being alone that was making me tense. Sometime later, maybe an hour or so, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't an animal noise. It was faint but sharp, like the sound of something brushing against fabric. Then a few seconds later, I heard the same sound again, this time slower. It was my tarp. I had tied it to the side of the tent earlier to keep my gear dry, and something was touching it. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, then stopped. Then there was a soft crunch like a footstep. It was close, maybe 10 feet away. The kind of distance where you can feel movement, not just hear it. I didn't move. I just stayed still, every muscle tight, eyes open in the dark. I could feel my heart pounding against the sleeping bag. Another sound came, a slow, dragging noise, like something being pulled through leaves. Then a pause. Then another step. At that point, I reached for my flashlight. My hand moved slow so it wouldn't make noise. When I clicked it on, I aimed it through the tent wall toward the sound. The beam was weak through the fabric, but it showed movement. A shape, tall and narrow, passing slowly between the trees. I couldn't make out any clear features, but it looked human. I stayed frozen. The figure stopped for a few seconds, then turned toward the light. It didn't come closer. It just stood there, facing the tent. I remember the exact feeling. My stomach dropped like I just stepped off a ledge. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't. My throat felt locked. After what felt like minutes, the shadow moved away, disappearing into the dark. I kept the flashlight on for a while, just listening. Eventually, I turned it off and sat there in the pitch black again, clutching my knife. Sleep wasn't an option. I stayed awake until I saw the first pale light of morning through the tent. When I finally got up, I stepped outside carefully, scanning the area. My tarp had a few small tears near the edge, like it had been pulled hard. The ground around it had prints, not boot prints exactly, but indentations that looked wide, almost like someone wearing worn-out shoes or no shoes at all. They weren't deep enough to be from an animal. I checked my gear. Everything was there: stove, food, pack hatchet. Nothing stolen. That almost made it worse, like whoever it was hadn't wanted anything except to be near. I packed up faster than I ever had before. My hands shook a little as I folded the tent. The forest looked normal again, calm, like nothing had happened. But I couldn't get the sound out of my head, that soft dragging and the crunch of leaves. I drove out of there without looking back. The dirt road twisted between tall pines, and every turn felt too quiet. About a mile from the clearing, I saw something odd on the side of the trail. It was a small pile of rocks, maybe 10 or 12, stacked in a neat column about 2 feet high. On top of it sat a piece of fabric, torn and faded green, the same color as my tarp. I stopped the truck and just stared at it for a while. The pile hadn't been there the day before. I hadn't seen anything like it when I drove in. I didn't get out. I just shifted into gear and kept going. When I finally got back to the highway, I felt like I'd escaped something. But that night, when I got home, I noticed small dirt marks along the bottom of my tailgate, like someone's hands had been there. I tried to tell myself it was from the road, from dust or branches, but the prints were too clean, too even. For the next week, I couldn't sleep well. Every sound in my apartment made me jump. Footsteps from the upstairs neighbor, pipes shifting, the hum of the fridge. I'd wake up at random hours, sweating, convinced I'd heard something outside. Once, around 2 in the morning, I went to check my truck through the window. There was nothing there, but my tarp, the one I'd folded and shoved in the garage, was missing. I thought maybe I'd left it somewhere. Maybe I'd thrown it in the wrong place when I unpacked, but I checked everywhere. It was gone. I didn't report anything. I didn't even tell anyone. It sounded too strange to explain without sounding paranoid. A week later, I drove back toward Bend for work, and curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I just wanted to see the road again, to prove it was nothing. I didn't plan to camp, just drive by. When I reached the turnoff, I noticed tire tracks, newer ones, heading down the same dirt road. They weren't mine. The tread was deeper, wider, maybe from a truck or SUV. I followed them for a bit but stopped before the creek. The pile of rocks was still there, except now it had 2 more stacked next to it, shorter ones. I didn't go further. I just sat there in my truck for a long minute, engine running, watching the tree line. I could feel the same tightness in my chest that I'd felt that night in the tent. That was the last time I went camping alone. I still go sometimes, but always with friends now, always near people, near noise, near lights. I don't know who or what was out there that night. Could have been some drifter, maybe someone living off the grid, maybe a hunter who'd seen my fire and decided to check it out. But whoever it was had been close, too close, and for some reason they hadn't said a word or made themselves known. They just watched. That's what bothers me the most. The silence. The way they moved through the dark without a sound, without rushing, like they knew exactly where to step. I think about that night sometimes when I'm driving through quiet places, especially when the woods start to close in around the road. I still remember that sound. The slow drag through the leaves, the crunch of dirt just outside the tent. And every time I set up camp now, I make sure there's nothing but open ground for 20 yards around me. But sometimes, even with all that space, even with people nearby, I still wake up in the middle of the night to silence. That same heavy stillness. And I lie there, listening, waiting, remembering the sound of something just standing there, breathing slow, hidden in the dark, watching me through the thin wall of my tent. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a few days off work and go camping alone with my 2 dogs, a black lab named Hunter and a tan mixed breed named Daisy. I'd been wanting to clear my head, spend a few nights away from people, and get back into the woods like I used to. I picked a spot in northern Montana, deep in the Flathead National Forest, far from any main campground. the kind of place where you don't see another soul for days. I loaded up my old Chevy with gear, food, and the dogs and headed out early in the morning. The drive was long and quiet. By the time I turned off the main road onto the forest trail, the sun was already dipping low, throwing long shadows across the dirt track. The trees grew thick around the narrow road, branches brushing the sides of my truck. The dogs had their noses pressed to the window, tails wagging, unaware that soon it'd be just us and miles of wilderness. After about an hour of bumping along rough trails, I found a small clearing near a stream. It wasn't on any map I had, but it felt right. Open enough for my tent and truck, shaded by tall pine and fir trees, and the sound of running water close by. I set up camp quickly, trying to finish before dark. The tent went up first, then the small fire pit I built out of rocks. The dogs explored the area, running in circles, sniffing every tree. I remember feeling peaceful as I cooked some beans and sausage over the fire that night. The air was cool, and the forest was quiet except for crickets and the soft splash of the creek. I fell asleep easily that night, the dogs curled up beside me in the tent. The first 2 days went by smoothly. I hiked during the day, fished in the creek, and rested in the evenings by the fire. Hunter and Daisy stayed close to me, chasing squirrels and playing in the shallow water. On the third night, though, things started to feel different. It began with the dogs acting strange. Around dusk, when I was getting ready to cook dinner, Hunter started growling low, staring toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing. His fur was raised, and Daisy was pacing near the tent, whining. I looked but saw nothing. The woods were quiet. Too quiet, I realized after a moment. No crickets, no wind. Not even the sound of the stream seemed as loud as before. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I figured it might be an animal, maybe a bear or a coyote wandering nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. The beam caught nothing but bark and shadows. Still, the dogs wouldn't calm down. Hunter stood stiff, his nose twitching, ears forward. Daisy kept glancing at me, then back toward the trees, her tail tucked. I tried to ignore it, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound seemed louder. A twig snapping, the rustle of branches, the wind shifting. The dogs didn't sleep either. They kept lifting their heads, listening, growling softly. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, heavy, moving through the brush near the edge of camp. The sound of dry leaves crunching, twigs snapping under weight. It wasn't the sound of a four-legged animal. It was 2 feet, 2 deliberate steps. I froze inside my sleeping bag, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Hunter started barking, deep and loud, and Daisy joined in, her growls sharp and anxious. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to look out. The beam swept across the clearing, nothing, but the sound had stopped too. It was just gone. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. After about 10 minutes, I got out and threw more wood on the fire, hoping the light would keep whatever it was away. The dogs stayed close, still alert. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I found tracks. Not animal prints, boot prints. They were faint, pressed into the dirt near the trees, just beyond where the firelight had reached. They led toward the creek and disappeared into the underbrush. I followed them for a short while, but they vanished in the mud near the water. It was strange, because I hadn't seen or heard another vehicle for days. Whoever it was must have come through the woods. I tried to shake it off and told myself maybe it was an old trail from a hunter or hiker. Still, I couldn't ignore how fresh the tracks looked, like they'd been made last night. I considered packing up, but I had one more night planned and didn't want to overthink it. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in and it started to drizzle. I made a small fire again and sat by it with the dogs, both of them quiet and sticking close. The forest felt different, heavier somehow. The light faded early behind the clouds, and I could barely see the tree line once it got dark. That night, it happened again. I was lying in the tent, rain tapping lightly on the fabric, when I heard movement. This time it wasn't slow. It was quick, like someone running through the woods but trying not to make noise. The dogs went wild, barking and growling, pushing against the tent flap. Then I heard it, a loud crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. Close, too close. I jumped up, unzipped the tent, and shined the flashlight out. The rain made it hard to see, but for a split second, I caught sight of something between the trees. A figure, tall, wearing dark clothing, standing just beyond the reach of the light. Then it turned and vanished into the woods. I felt my stomach drop. I knew then that someone was watching the camp. I didn't waste another second. I threw my gear into the truck as fast as I could, not caring about leaving stuff behind. The dogs barked and growled the whole time, their eyes fixed on the trees. I kept the flashlight in one hand and my other on the truck keys. When I finally slammed the doors shut and started the engine, the noise echoed through the clearing. As I turned the headlights toward the trail out, the beams cut across the trees, and for a brief moment, I saw movement again. Someone ducked behind a trunk, too fast for me to make out a face. I hit the gas and didn't stop until I was miles down the road, not even caring how rough the trail was. It took me nearly an hour to get back to the paved road. The whole drive, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or someone walking along the roadside. But there was nothing, just the dark forest fading behind me. When I finally stopped at a small gas station near Kalispell, the adrenaline started to wear off. I sat there for a long time, hands still shaking, dogs panting in the back seat. I looked over my shoulder and saw the sleeping bags, the tent poles, and some of the food I'd forgotten to pack. I didn't care. I wasn't going back for any of it. The next morning, after some rest, I called the local ranger office and told them where I'd been camping and what I'd seen. The ranger said they'd send someone to check it out. A few days later, I got a call back. They'd found signs that someone had been living not far from that area. An old camp, a makeshift shelter, and a few scattered belongings. No one was there when they arrived. To this day, I don't know who it was out there that night. A hermit, a drifter, or maybe someone who didn't want to be found. But I know for sure that I wasn't alone. I haven't gone camping that deep into the woods again since then. I still take the dogs on hikes and day trips, but when the sun starts to go down, I'm back near people, where lights and noise fill the night instead of silence. Every now and then, when I hear the wind moving through the trees, I think about that clearing, about the figure standing at the edge of the light, watching, and I can still feel that same chill crawl up my spine, the same one that told me it was time to get out before it was too late. It was late September 2016. The air in northern Idaho had that early bite of fall, cold enough to sting my nose when I breathed in too deep. I had taken a week off from work just to be alone. No phone service, no traffic, no people. I'd been working maintenance at a paper mill for almost 5 years straight. Double shifts, noise every day. I wanted quiet, so I packed my old Ford Ranger, grabbed my tent, rifle, cooler, and gear, and drove out to a place called Creek Trail Reserve, about 30 miles from any town. I'd been there once before, years ago, with my uncle when we hunted elk. It wasn't an official campground, just a long dirt trail that followed a narrow creek through thick pine forest. Most people didn't go that far in. The road was rough and washed out in spots. That was what I liked, the isolation. The first day went smooth. I set up camp near the bend of the creek, where the ground was flat and soft. I had enough firewood nearby to last a few nights. I pitched my tent under 2 old spruce trees and built a small pit with rocks for the fire. The sound of running water mixed with the wind in the trees made it almost peaceful. Exactly what I needed. As the sun went down, I sat near the fire and ate canned beans straight from the tin. I watched the flames and listened to nothing but the water and the wind. Around midnight, when I was lying inside my tent, I heard something splash in the creek. Heavy, like a person stepping in. It wasn't the light stepping sound deer usually make. I waited, holding my breath. After maybe 30 seconds, it went quiet again. I figured it could have been a beaver or maybe a moose. I didn't think much of it. The next morning, the first thing I noticed were prints in the mud by the water. They looked like boot prints, human. I crouched and checked the shape carefully. They weren't mine. The sole pattern was different, more like a hiking boot with deep ridges. The weird part was how close they were to my camp. Whoever it was had come within 20 feet of my tent. That put a weight in my stomach. I looked around for more signs, but there weren't any tracks going back out. They just came down the creek and stopped near my camp, then vanished. Maybe someone crossed through during the night, I told myself. But even then, what kind of person hikes through this area at midnight? By afternoon, I tried to shake it off. I went out hiking with my rifle slung over my shoulder. The woods were thick and uneven. The air smelled like damp pine and dirt. I followed a game trail for a couple miles, then sat near a fallen log and watched the tree lean. I didn't see or hear a thing, but I couldn't relax fully. The quiet felt heavier than usual. When I got back to camp around dusk, I noticed something strange. My tent zipper was half open. I never leave it open. Mosquitoes and cold air get in. Inside, nothing looked taken, but my backpack had been moved. I always keep it right next to the sleeping bag, but now it was near the corner of the tent. A couple of energy bars that had been in the side pocket were gone. That was it. I stood there for a while, listening. The forest was dead silent. Not even a bird. I could feel my heartbeat in my neck. I checked the trees, the creek, everywhere. Nothing. No movement. I thought maybe it was a bear. They'll go through food even inside tents. But there were no claw marks, no torn fabric, no mess. Whoever did it had opened the zipper carefully. I ended up staying awake late that night, sitting by the fire with my rifle across my knees. I stared into the dark tree line. Every small sound, a twig snapping, water trickling, made my head turn. Around 2 a.m., I caught a faint movement by the creek, maybe 50 yards out. It was a shape, tall, standing still just beyond the firelight. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks, but it didn't move. I didn't shout or make noise. I just raised my rifle and aimed toward it. My hands were shaking. After a few seconds, the shape slowly turned and walked into the trees. The way it moved wasn't like an animal, it was upright. I sat there frozen for a long time. When I finally went inside the tent, I left my boots on and the rifle next to me. Sleep barely came. Every rustle felt like footsteps. The next morning, I checked the creek again. There were fresh boot prints leading away into the woods. The same pattern as before. I decided then I wasn't staying another night. I started packing immediately, keeping the rifle loaded beside me. As I folded the tent, I heard a crack, wood snapping somewhere behind me, up the hill. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I froze. Then another sound came, this time like something being dragged through leaves. Slow, deliberate. I yelled out, mostly out of panic, even though I knew there was no one to answer. My own voice echoed back. The dragging sound stopped. I threw everything into the truck bed without order. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, all of it. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before getting the engine started. When I started driving out, the dirt road felt endless. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking down the middle of the trail. The trees pressed in close from both sides, blocking most of the light. About a mile from camp, I passed a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. There was an old fire ring, rocks arranged in a circle, and something hanging from a branch nearby. I slowed down and stared. It was a small deer skull tied with a piece of wire to the limb, swinging slowly in the breeze. That image burned into me. It wasn't fresh, not new, but seeing it after everything that happened hit different. I didn't stop. I just kept driving. When I finally hit paved road, I pulled over and sat there for maybe 10 minutes, breathing hard, trying to calm down. The adrenaline wouldn't quit. I felt watched even there. I drove straight home and didn't tell anyone about it for a long time. It sounded too strange to explain. Some stranger in the woods, sneaking around campsites at night, following trails barefoot or in boots, moving things inside people's tents. There was no proof, just prints and that skull. A week later, curiosity got the best of me. I looked online for news from that area, Creek Trail Reserve, or anything nearby. Buried on a local forum, I found a thread about missing hikers in the same region. One post mentioned an unmarked campsite found abandoned. Tents slashed open, food scattered, no sign of the person. That post was from August. That was when it really sank in that I hadn't just imagined it. Whoever was out there wasn't camping for fun. It's been years now, and I still think about that night sometimes. When I'm driving through woods or stop on a quiet road, I catch myself checking the mirrors, scanning the tree line, looking for that same still shape just outside the light. I never went back to Creek Trail or anywhere near it. I still camp sometimes, but only in open places where I can see a long way around me. Every time I pack up, I make sure to double-check everything. Tent zippers closed, food sealed, gear in reach. I always set my campfire close to where I can see the shadows move clearly. Because once you've seen someone standing out there, silent and still waiting, you never stop watching for them again. It was late September 2019. The weather in northern Idaho had already started turning cold, and I had been planning a solo camping trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from work, away from my phone, and just be somewhere quiet for a few days. I packed light, just a small tent, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried food, and my old Remington rifle in case I came across any wildlife. I'd camped alone plenty of times before, and I didn't think much of it. I drove out early in the morning, my truck loaded with gear, heading toward a forested area near Priest Lake. It wasn't an official campsite, but I knew a small clearing about half a mile off an old logging road where people sometimes set up. By the time I got there, it was almost noon. The air was cool, crisp, and carried that pine smell I always loved. I parked the truck on the side of the road, grabbed my backpack, and hiked down through the trees. The ground was damp from rain the night before, and fallen pine needles made everything soft and quiet under my boots. After about 15 minutes of walking, I reached the clearing. It was a perfect spot, surrounded by trees, flat ground, and a small creek about 50 yards away. I set up camp quickly. I pitched my tent, stacked some firewood, and laid out my gear neatly. I ate a sandwich I'd brought along and sat by the creek for a while, listening to the water run over the rocks. It felt peaceful, exactly what I wanted. I didn't see a single person or hear a car the whole day. The forest was still, except for the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. As the sun started going down, I made a small fire and cooked a bit of freeze-dried stew. The smell mixed with the smoke and the forest air. That scent you only get while camping. When it got dark, I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and laid there listening to the fire crackle until I drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was dead silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Just that heavy stillness that feels unnatural in the woods. I stayed still for a moment, trying to figure out what woke me up. Then I heard it, faint crunching sounds outside my tent. Slow, uneven steps moving through the pine needles. It wasn't an animal moving quickly or grazing. It sounded like someone walking. My heart started beating faster. I reached for my rifle, keeping my hand on it but not unzipping the tent. The footsteps came closer, soft but distinct. Then they stopped. I held my breath, waiting. A few seconds later, I heard a light scrape, like something brushing against my cooler that was sitting just outside. The sound of plastic shifting slightly, then nothing again. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, barely moving, just listening. I thought about calling out, but it didn't feel right. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. Eventually, the sounds faded away, and after a long while, I must have drifted off again because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. Outside, everything looked normal. My cooler was slightly out of place, and one of the straps on my backpack was undone, but nothing was missing. I tried to brush it off as maybe a raccoon or some other animal, even though the steps I'd heard didn't sound like that. I tried not to think about it too much. I spent the day hiking along the creek, following it downstream until I found a small waterfall. It was quiet and beautiful. I stayed there for a while, just watching the water hit the rocks. When I got back to camp that evening, I noticed something strange. There were faint boot prints near my tent. Not mine. They were smaller, like a size or two down, and they were fresh. I felt that cold rush of adrenaline hit me instantly. The prints came from the direction of the forest, circled part of the campsite, and then went back the way they came. I scanned the tree line for any sign of movement, but everything was still. I tried to convince myself that maybe some hunter had wandered through, but I hadn't heard a gunshot all day. I didn't make a fire that night. I sat quietly inside my tent with the lantern off, just listening. Around midnight, I heard the same slow crunching again. This time, it came from the direction of the creek. I could tell it was a person, the pace, the rhythm, the way it stopped every few steps. It moved closer to camp, and I could make out the sound of breathing, faint but there. I held the rifle close and stared at the tent wall. My pulse was pounding in my ears. Then I heard it, a long, drawn-out exhale, like someone standing just a few feet away. Then another slow step. I could hear the leaves and twigs shifting under the weight. I stayed completely still, my finger tight on the trigger guard. After a while, the steps stopped again. Silence. Then, slowly, I heard retreating footsteps, moving back toward the creek until they faded out completely. I didn't sleep after that. When the first light came through the trees, I packed up immediately. I didn't even make coffee or eat breakfast. I took down the tent, threw everything in my backpack, and started heading toward the truck. The woods felt different now, heavier, like something was watching. I kept glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, but there was no one. When I finally reached the logging road, I felt a bit of relief seeing my truck, but that feeling disappeared the second I saw the driver's side door. It was open, not wide, just cracked, like someone had tried to look inside but didn't take anything. I checked the truck. Nothing was stolen, not even the small stuff in the glove box. But on the dirt beside the door, there were more footprints, same size as the ones near the tent. I got in, locked the doors, and drove off without looking back. The drive out felt endless, the forest stretching on forever before I hit the highway. When I got home, I couldn't shake it off. For days, I kept replaying the sounds in my head. The slow footsteps, the breathing, the quiet scraping near the cooler. I kept thinking about how whoever it was had to know I was there. They'd walked right up to my tent, close enough to hear me breathing, maybe even close enough to see my shadow from the inside. A week later, I checked an online forum where locals talked about hiking and camping around Priest Lake. I found a thread from someone who'd camped in the same general area around the same time. They mentioned waking up to footsteps outside their tent too. and later finding boot prints near their campsite. They also said their truck door had been left open one morning. I never replied to that post. I didn't even want to think about it anymore. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone and never anywhere near there. I started keeping a small trail camera with me, and I don't stay overnight unless I'm certain no one else is around for miles. That trip in 2019 changed how I see the woods. I used to love the quiet. Now, when it gets too quiet, I can't relax. I just start listening, waiting for the sound of footsteps in the dark again. It was July of 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through Austria. I had been traveling through Europe for a few months, and most of it had been crowded cities, loud hostels, and too many people. I wanted quiet. I wanted somewhere that didn't have the sound of cars or drunk tourists outside the window. A friend had mentioned an old campsite near the edge of a forest in the Salzkammergut region, not far from a small village that barely showed up on Google Maps. The reviews online were minimal, just a few posts saying it was peaceful, cheap, and close to a lake. That was all I needed. I arrived there late in the afternoon after driving for hours through narrow, winding roads that cut through the mountains. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and damp soil. When I got to the campsite, it was mostly empty except for one camper van parked near the entrance. The rest of the area was quiet, surrounded by trees and a thin dirt path that led deeper into the woods. The lake was about half a mile away, and I could hear the faint sound of water moving whenever the wind shifted. I set up my small tent near the treeline, just far enough to get some shade but still have a view of the open clearing. The ground was soft, and there were wildflowers growing around the edges. It felt peaceful in a lonely kind of way. I cooked a quick meal on my little camping stove, just some noodles, and watched the sky turn from orange to a dark blue. There were no lights nearby, so when the sun finally went down, the place turned completely black except for my small lantern and the glow of my campfire. By around 10 p.m., I was sitting by the fire, writing in a small notebook. That's when I first saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight. The trees were moving in the wind, their shadows stretching and twisting across the clearing. But then I noticed a shape between the trees, too still to be a shadow. It was a person, a woman, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight. I could see her outline, thin and tall, her clothes blending with the dark. Her hair looked long, maybe shoulder length, but I couldn't make out her face. She was just standing there, facing my direction, not moving. I froze. My first thought was that maybe she was another camper, maybe lost or just walking through. But there was something off about how she stood there. Not walking, not adjusting her posture, not doing anything. Just standing, watching. I turned my lantern toward the trees, trying to get a better look. The light reached the edge of the forest, but by the time it touched the spot where she had been, she was gone. The space between the trees was empty. I listened, waiting for footsteps or rustling leaves, but all I could hear was the wind. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was tired, maybe just imagining things. I put out the fire around midnight and went into my tent. The forest was silent except for the occasional crack of branches far away. Sometime during the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. It was just that strange kind of waking where your body feels alert before your mind catches up. I listened for a few seconds. That's when I heard something faint outside the tent. It sounded like light footsteps on the dirt. Slow, dragging steps, circling around my tent. I could hear leaves being crushed underfoot, then silence, then more steps. I held my breath, trying not to move. I thought about calling out, but I didn't. I didn't even reach for my lantern. I just stayed there, listening. The steps stopped behind the tent, near my backpack. Then I heard something soft, like fabric brushing against the nylon wall of the tent. It was the slowest sound I'd ever heard, like someone was dragging their hand along it. After a minute, everything went quiet again. I lay there for what felt like hours, barely blinking, until exhaustion took over and I finally fell asleep. When I woke up, the sky was gray and my stomach was tight with unease. I stepped outside, and the ground around my tent had footprints. Bare footprints, small and thin, circling around twice. The dirt was still damp from the night dew, so the prints were clear. They led from the edge of the woods around my tent, and then disappeared back toward the trees. I packed my things slowly, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just someone passing by, maybe curious or lost. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had been watching me for a while. I decided to hike down to the lake to clear my head. The trail was narrow, lined with moss and roots, and the air smelled of rain. The lake was still and quiet, a mirror of the gray sky above. I sat by the edge for a while, eating a small breakfast, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. That's when I noticed her again. Across the lake, near the opposite bank, there was someone standing by the water, the same woman. Her clothes were light-colored now that I could see better, an old white dress that looked worn and dirty near the bottom. Her hair hung flat, dark and stringy, and even from a distance, I could tell she was staring toward me. I stood up slowly. My chest felt heavy, and my breathing turned shallow. I didn't know what to do. There was no one else around. No sign of hikers or campers, just her. Then, as if she realized I'd seen her, she stepped backward into the trees and vanished again. I didn't wait any longer. I walked back to my campsite, packed everything fast, and loaded it into my car. But as I was zipping up the tent, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small, torn piece of white fabric caught on one of the stakes. It looked exactly like the dress she had been wearing. I threw it away and left immediately. The drive back down the mountain road felt endless. Every time I checked my rearview mirror, I half expected to see someone standing in the road behind me. By the time I reached the village, it was late afternoon. I stopped at a small cafe to calm down. The woman behind the counter spoke some English, and I asked if there were other campers in the area. She said not many this season. Most people avoided the forest after dark because of old stories. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. I stayed in a cheap inn that night, my tent still packed in the car. Couldn't sleep much. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I finally dozed off. When I woke up in the morning, I went outside to grab something from the car. There was something on the windshield, a wet handprint. Small, thin fingers pressed against the glass. It was too clear to be old, and the dew around it hadn't disturbed the shape. I just stood there, staring at it. I looked around the empty parking lot, scanning every corner, but there was no one. That was the last time I went camping alone. Sometimes, when I think about that trip, I still try to make sense of it. Maybe it was just some local woman who lived near the forest. Maybe she wandered around at night. Maybe the footprints and the handprint were from someone else entirely. But no matter how many explanations I come up with, I can still picture her standing there at the edge of the trees, completely still, watching, not saying a word. Even now, years later, whenever I see a dense forest at dusk, I feel the same tightness in my chest. The same feeling that someone could be standing just beyond what I can see. I don't camp anymore. I don't hike alone either, because it's not the thought of what might have happened that scares me the most. It's knowing that she was real. Someone was out there that night watching me, and I'll never know why. It was the fall of 2016, somewhere deep in the backcountry of northern Montana. I was 26 then, and hunting was something I'd grown up doing. My uncle had given me an old Winchester rifle that still worked fine, and every October I'd head out for a few days alone, away from everything. That year, I decided to push deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone. I wanted quiet. No cell signal, no noise, no people. Just me, the cold air, and the sound of the woods. The road I took turned to dirt about 20 miles from the nearest town. From there, I drove another hour until it became more rocks than road. When I finally stopped, there wasn't a sign of anyone. No cabins, no tire marks, nothing. I parked near a clearing, packed up my rifle, food, tent, and gear and started walking. The air was sharp and dry, with that smell of pine and cold soil. The trees were tall and tight together, the ground layered with needles and broken branches. I remember thinking it was perfect, too far for anyone else to bother coming out here. By the time I reached the spot I wanted to camp, the sun was getting low. I found a flat area beside a small stream. The water was freezing, moving just enough to make a soft sound that carried through the trees. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and made a small fire. The temperature dropped fast once the sun was gone. I ate some jerky, watched the light fade from orange to black, and listened to the forest. There was no wind, no insects, not even the sound of a bird. Just silence. That first night was calm. I slept fine, except once when I woke up to what sounded like something stepping on dry sticks near the edge of my camp. It stopped as soon as I sat up. I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I went back to sleep. The next morning, fog hung low across the trees. I followed the stream for about a mile and then cut uphill toward a ridge. I spent most of the day walking, scanning the slopes for movement. I saw nothing, no tracks, no droppings, no signs of life. It was strange. Usually you'd see at least some signs, but it felt like everything was gone. Around noon, I found a tree that looked like it had been clawed at. Not deep cuts, just rough scrapes at shoulder height. Maybe a bear, I thought. The bark was fresh, and the wood underneath was pale. I marked it in my head and kept going. As the day went on, the quiet started to bother me. Even in the middle of nowhere, there's usually sound, birds, branches moving, something. But this place felt dead. Every few minutes I caught myself stopping to listen, thinking I'd heard footsteps, but it was just the sound of my own movement echoing between the trees. When I finally headed back toward camp, the sun was already dropping behind the ridge, and that uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. When I got back, I noticed the fire pit had been disturbed. The ashes were spread out, and a few of my sticks had been broken in half. I hadn't left it that way. My tent was fine, but my cooler had been moved about 2 feet from where I'd set it. The lid was still on tight, though, and there weren't any claw marks or bites. I stood there for a minute, just staring at it, trying to make sense of it. Maybe an animal had pushed it, but it didn't look like that. It looked like someone had grabbed it and slid it. I built another fire as the sky went dark, but this time I kept my rifle next to me. The forest seemed even quieter than before, if that was possible. I kept scanning the treeline, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing, just black trees and mist. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing small, soft crunches, like something moving slow in the distance. Every time I turned toward the sound, it stopped. The next morning, I checked the ground around camp. I found tracks, not clear ones, but impressions. Barefoot, not animal, human. The prints were faint, but they circled my camp once and led off toward the trees. I felt a chill crawl up my back. It didn't make sense. No one should have been out there. I hadn't seen a single car, cabin, or trail marker for hours. Whoever it was had to have walked miles to reach this place. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe a lost hiker, maybe someone passing through. I didn't want to believe it was anything else. I went hunting again, but I couldn't focus. Every time I crouched or stopped to look around, I felt like I was being watched. That evening, I was about a half mile from camp when I noticed something strange near a tree. Hanging from a branch was what looked like a strip of fabric. I walked closer and realized it was a piece of dirty cloth, maybe from a shirt. It was torn and stiff, like it had been there a while. Beneath it was a small pile of stones stacked in a weird pattern. Not random, not natural. I felt my stomach tighten. Someone had been marking something or maybe leaving signs. I got back to camp just before dark. My firewood was gone. All of it. I hadn't left it far, just a few feet from the tent, and now there wasn't a single piece left. My pack had been unzipped too, but nothing was taken. Whoever it was had gone through my things. That was enough for me. I decided I'd leave in the morning as soon as there was light. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, I heard it. Slow steps in the leaves, coming from the trees behind my tent. They'd stop, then start again, circling. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I gripped my rifle tight and stayed still. The steps got closer, maybe 20 feet away, then stopped again. The fire had burned down low, and I couldn't see past the shadows. I thought about shining my flashlight, but something in me said not to. I waited, motionless, for what felt like hours. At some point, I must have dozed off from exhaustion. When I woke up, it was gray and cold. I got out of the tent and saw new footprints, clearer this time. Bare feet, large. The prints came from the trees, circled my camp twice, and then led back into the woods. I packed everything as fast as I could and started hiking back toward the truck. I didn't stop, didn't rest. I just kept moving. About halfway there, I noticed something ahead on the trail. A small figure crouched low beside a log. I froze. It looked like a person, maybe sitting or kneeling. They were still, completely still. I stood there for a few seconds, watching, trying to make out details. Then, without any sound, they stood up. Tall, thin, barefoot. Their clothes looked dark and torn, and their skin was pale like ash. They didn't move toward me. They just turned and walked slowly into the trees. I didn't wait. I ran the rest of the way back. When I finally reached the truck, I threw everything in the bed and drove until I hit pavement. I didn't look back once. A week later, I told one of the forest rangers what happened. He said there were old reports years ago of squatters or drifters living deep in those woods, people who'd gone off the grid. Some had been chased off, others just vanished. He said it wasn't impossible that one was still out there. I haven't been hunting alone since. Every fall, when the air turns cold and I smell pine and dirt again, I think about that place. I think about the quiet, and I remember those barefoot prints circling my tent. How close they were, how someone must have stood there watching me while I slept. That's the part that never leaves. Not what I saw, but knowing that whoever it was had been there long before I noticed, and maybe if I hadn't left when I did, I never would have left at all. It was October of 2019 when I decided to go camping alone in northern Arizona. I was 24, fresh out of a long relationship, and needed to clear my head. I'd been hiking and camping my whole life, so going solo didn't scare me. I picked a place deep in the Coconino National Forest, a few miles off a dirt road where no one would bother me. I had my truck, a small tent, and enough food for 3 nights. I planned to hike, read, and maybe take some pictures of the stars. The first day went just like I hoped. The air was dry, the pine smell was sharp, and I barely saw a soul on the drive in. I parked near a clearing that sloped down toward a dry creek bed. I set up my tent close to a cluster of rocks for wind protection and gathered some firewood before dark. The only sound was the wind moving through the tall pines. When night fell, the sky was so clear I could see the Milky Way stretch across it. I remember sitting by the fire that night, thinking it was exactly what I needed. Quiet, no one around, just nature. The next morning I hiked a ridge a couple of miles from camp. From up there, I could see the forest spread endlessly in every direction. It was beautiful but also isolating. Around noon, I noticed something strange near one of the trees down the slope. A deer carcass, but not torn apart like from a mountain lion. It looked almost peeled. The hide was missing from its back legs and part of its face, but the rest was intact. There wasn't much blood around it either. It looked wrong. I told myself maybe some scavenger had started on it and got scared off. Still, it stuck in my head the rest of the day. By the time I got back to camp, I tried to shake it off. I made a small fire, cooked some beans, and read a bit. As the sun started to set, I noticed the forest felt heavier. It's hard to explain, but the quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. The air seemed to thicken. There weren't any birds. Usually you hear at least something, an owl, a cricket, wind through branches, but it was dead quiet. I figured maybe the temperature drop had something to do with it. Still, when I went to sleep that night, I left the fire burning low. Somewhere around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized I could hear something moving outside my tent. Slow steps, crunching pine needles. It wasn't close, maybe 20 or 30 feet away, circling. I held still, listening. The steps stopped. Then I heard what sounded like someone breathing, but uneven, like a person trying to catch their breath after running. I thought maybe it was an animal, but I couldn't match the sound to anything familiar. My hand went to the small hatchet I kept next to my sleeping bag. I didn't move or make a sound for maybe 10 minutes. Eventually, the breathing faded, and the forest went silent again. I didn't sleep after that. When the sun came up, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. Nothing looked disturbed, no footprints that I could clearly see. I walked the area around the camp for a while, checking for any signs of animals, but there wasn't much, just a few broken branches. I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe my mind played tricks on me in the dark. Later that day, I decided to stay closer to camp. I spent time cleaning up, reorganizing my gear, and chopping more wood. The weather started shifting in the afternoon, gray clouds building over the ridge. It got colder fast. I ate an early dinner and got the fire going before dark. Around dusk, I thought I saw someone far off between the trees. A shape, maybe a person, standing still. I stared for a long time, but the light kept changing with the wind. 1 second I thought it was just a burnt tree stump, then it looked like it moved. I blinked hard and it was gone. That night I couldn't relax. The fire popped and cracked, and every sound made me tense up. Around midnight, the wind picked up, came in bursts, like it was pushing something through the trees. I started hearing faint noises again. Footsteps, snapping twigs, a low rustling that came and went. This time it was closer. I sat up, clutching my hatchet, barely breathing. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard what sounded like my own name. Not loud, not clear, but it sounded off, stretched, like someone trying to copy my voice but not doing it right. I froze completely. My skin went cold. I told myself I must have imagined it, but it came again, softer, almost like it was repeating itself. My name, but wrong. I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent. I just sat there until the sound stopped. Then silence again. I didn't sleep that night either. When daylight came, I made the decision to leave. I packed up everything as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw my gear in the truck and started driving back down the dirt road. I must have gone only a mile before I saw something in the distance, standing near a bend where the road curved through the trees. At first, I thought it was a person, tall, thin, standing too straight. I slowed down, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't right. It looked like someone, but its limbs seemed too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It was just standing there on the side of the road, facing away. I didn't stop. I just kept driving, heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. When I looked in the rearview mirror, it was gone. Completely. No sign of anyone, no movement between the trees. I drove straight to the highway and didn't look back once. When I got home that evening, I didn't unpack for a few days. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, even though I knew that made no sense. I kept replaying everything in my head. The deer, the breathing, the voice, that thing on the road. I started reading about local wildlife, thinking maybe there was some rational explanation. That's when I came across old Navajo stories about something called a skinwalker. I don't believe in that kind of stuff, not really, but some of the descriptions, they lined up too well. People said they could mimic human voices, even shapes. Still, I tried to dismiss it. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. A few weeks later, though, I had to drive that same route again, past the turnoff that led into the forest. It was broad daylight this time, sun high in the sky, and I figured maybe I'd stop for a second just to prove to myself there was nothing to be scared of. I pulled over where the dirt road started, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air smelled the same, dry pine, dust, a faint trace of rain from the night before. Everything was still. I stood there for maybe a minute before I noticed something carved into a tree just off the path. It was fresh, cut deep into the bark. It was a name, my name. The cuts were jagged, uneven, like they'd been made with a dull blade. I felt this rush of heat go through me, followed by the coldest kind of fear I've ever felt. I didn't take a picture. I didn't even look around. I got back in my truck and drove until I reached Flagstaff without stopping once. I haven't been camping since. I sold most of my gear the next month. People still invite me on trips sometimes, but I always find an excuse not to go. Every now and then, though, when I'm driving alone through wooded areas, I catch myself checking the mirrors more than I should, especially when it's quiet, when the road bends, and there's nothing but trees on both sides. Because sometimes, in those moments, I feel like something's still watching me from the tree line. Something that knows my name. And that's enough to keep me away from the woods for good.